This is insubordination, sailor. You will be court-martialed for this.
Sir, with all due respect, I couldn't stand by and watch.
That man has no business touching this submarine. That's what Commander Ellison said when he saw 71-year-old Walter Briggs reach for a wrench near the engine compartment of the USS Tarpon. Walter didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just pulled his hand back, tucked the rag into his belt loop and went back to mopping the deck plating like he'd been doing for the last 9 years. 9 years of mopping. 9 years of emptying trash cans and scrubbing toilets and replacing light bulbs in a floating museum that most people walked through in 45 minutes and never thought about again. 9 years of keeping his mouth shut while men half his age talked about submarines like they'd invented them. But Walter Briggs knew something none of them knew. He knew a secret buried so deep inside that old diesel boat that it had never appeared in a single maintenance manual, a single engineering schematic, or a single Navy technical document in the entire history of the United States submarine fleet. And that secret was about to save the Navy from the most embarrassing public failure in its modern memory. If you believe that real heroes don't always wear uniforms, comment the word deep right now, and stay with me for this one. The USS Tarpon was a Tench-class diesel-electric submarine, one of the last of her kind, built in 1945 at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine. She'd been laid down in the closing months of World War II, launched just weeks before the Japanese surrender, and had spent the better part of 2 decades patrolling the cold black waters of the Atlantic and Pacific during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. She was 311 feet of welded steel, powered by 4 Fairbanks Morse opposed piston diesel engines and a battery array that could move her through the deep at nearly 16 knots submerged. She carried a crew of 81 men who lived in conditions most modern sailors would refuse to tolerate. No air conditioning, no privacy. Bunks stacked 3 high in compartments so narrow, 2 men couldn't pass each other without turning sideways. The smell of diesel fuel soaked into everything, into the clothes, the skin, the food, the dreams. Submariners called it the perfume of the deep, and the men who served aboard boats like the Tarpon were a breed apart. They volunteered for duty that most sailors considered insane. They sealed themselves inside a steel tube, dove beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, and trusted their lives to valves, gauges, and the men standing next to them. There was no margin for error. One miscalculation, one stuck valve, one moment of hesitation, and the ocean would crush them like a tin can under a boot. By the mid-1970s, the diesel boats were being phased out, replaced by nuclear submarines that could stay submerged indefinitely and circle the globe without surfacing. The Tarpon was decommissioned in 1976, stripped of her classified equipment, and eventually donated to the city of Hampton, Virginia, where she was moored at the waterfront as a floating museum and memorial. For decades she sat there, a quiet monument to a vanishing era, visited mostly by schoolchildren and aging veterans who would walk her narrow passageways one last time and remember what it felt like to be young and terrified and alive in the belly of a machine designed to kill and to hide. Walter Briggs had started working at the museum in 2016. He was 62 then, recently widowed, living alone in a small apartment 6 blocks from the waterfront. He'd answered a classified ad in the local paper for a part-time maintenance position. The interview lasted about 4 minutes. The museum director, a retired Navy captain named David Holloway, had looked at Walter's application, noted his age, asked if he could handle stairs and confined spaces, and hired him on the spot. The pay was barely above minimum wage. The work was unglamorous. Walter swept, mopped, cleaned the restrooms, polished the brass fittings that the tourists liked to touch, replaced burned-out bulbs in the exhibit cases, and made sure the gangway was safe when the weather turned wet. He wore grey coveralls with the museum's logo stitched over the breast pocket and a pair of steel-toed boots that had seen better decades. He was quiet, polite, kept to himself mostly. The younger staff knew him as Walt, the old guy who always showed up early and never complained. Some of them assumed he was a retired factory worker, or maybe a school custodian. Nobody asked, and Walter never volunteered. He'd eat his lunch alone in the aft torpedo room, sitting on an old folding chair he'd brought from home, reading paperback westerns and drinking coffee from a thermos his wife had given him for their 30th anniversary. Sometimes, if the museum was empty and the afternoon light came in just right through the open hatches, he'd run his hand along the bulkhead and close his eyes and listen to the silence. And in that silence, he could hear everything. The rumble of the diesels, the hiss of the ballast tanks, the creak of the hull under pressure, the voice of his old chief petty officer barking orders through the intercom, the sounds of a life he'd never told anyone about. The trouble started in the spring of 2025, when the Department of the Navy announced a major initiative called Heritage Alive. The program was designed to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the modern submarine force by bringing decommissioned submarines back to operational status for a series of live demonstrations at naval museums across the country. The idea was ambitious and, critics said, borderline reckless. Selected submarines would be refitted with enough operational capability to perform controlled dives in shallow protected waters, giving the public a first-hand look at how these legendary boats actually functioned. The USS Tarpon was chosen as the flagship demonstration vessel. She was in relatively good structural condition, her pressure hull had been inspected and certified by naval engineers, and her location in Hampton Roads provided access to the calm, shallow waters of the Chesapeake Bay. The Navy allocated a budget of $4.7 million for the refit and assigned a team of 12 active-duty mechanics and engineers from the Naval Submarine Base in New London, Connecticut, to oversee the work. The project was led by Commander Ryan Ellison, a 38-year-old nuclear submarine officer who had never served on a diesel boat in his life, but who had a reputation for getting things done on time and under budget. Ellison arrived in Hampton in late April with his team, a container full of replacement parts, and the unshakable confidence of a man who believed that any mechanical problem could be solved with enough computing power and the right technical manuals. He was wrong. The first 3 months went smoothly enough. The team replaced corroded piping, rebuilt the main diesel engines, installed new battery cells, overhauled the electrical distribution system, and refurbished the control room instrumentation. The Tarpon was beginning to look like a functioning submarine again. Local news crews came to film the progress. The Navy's Public Affairs Office released polished videos showing young sailors in hard hats working alongside civilian contractors, with stirring music and graphics counting down to the scheduled demonstration date of October 15th. Tickets for the public viewing event sold out within hours. Congressional representatives from Virginia and Connecticut announced they would attend. The Secretary of the Navy confirmed his presence. It was going to be the most high-profile naval heritage event in decades, and then they tried to make her dive. The ballast system on a diesel submarine is deceptively simple in concept, but brutally complex in execution. To submerge, the boat floods its main ballast tanks with seawater, making itself heavier than the water around it. To surface, compressed air is blown into the tanks, forcing the water out and restoring buoyancy. The process is controlled by a network of valves, known as flood valves and vent valves, that must open and close in precise sequence. On the Tarpon, this system was operated from the control room using a series of hydraulic actuators connected to a master control panel called the Christmas tree, named for its rows of red and green indicator lights showing the status of every hull opening on the boat. Ellison's team had rebuilt the entire hydraulic system. They'd replaced every gasket, every seal, every actuator cylinder. They'd tested each valve individually and confirmed that every one of them opened and closed properly. The Christmas tree lit up perfectly, all green, every indicator showing a sealed and functioning boat. But when they attempted the first integrated ballast test in the controlled flooding basin at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, something was wrong. The main ballast tanks would not flood evenly. The forward tanks took on water normally, but the aft tanks lagged behind by a critical margin, creating a dangerous down angle that would have put the submarine's bow into the mud if they'd been in open water. They ran the test again. Same result, and again, same result. Ellison ordered a complete diagnostic of the aft ballast system. His engineers crawled through every inch of piping, checked every valve, tested every actuator. Everything checked out perfectly. On paper, the system was flawless. In practice, it refused to work. 6 weeks of troubleshooting produced nothing. Ellison brought in additional engineers from the Naval Sea Systems Command. He consulted with retired submarine officers. He pulled original blueprints from the National Archives. He ran computer simulations modelling the fluid dynamics of the ballast system. Nothing explained the discrepancy. The aft tanks simply would not flood at the correct rate, and no one could figure out why. The October 15th demonstration date came and went. It was quietly postponed to November, then to December, then to an indefinite date to be announced. The media began asking questions. A reporter from the Norfolk Virginian Pilot published an article with the headline "Navy Can't Make Old Subs Sink." which was picked up by national outlets and became a minor embarrassment for the service. Congressional staffers started making phone calls. The Secretary of the Navy's office sent a terse memo requesting a status update and a revised timeline. Ellison, who had never failed to deliver on a project in his career, was working 18-hour days and losing weight. His team was exhausted and demoralized. They had tried everything they could think of, and the Tarpon was still sitting in her berth, stubbornly refusing to dive like a proper submarine. It was during one of these late nights, well past midnight on a cold Tuesday in January, that Walter Briggs changed everything. Walter had been watching the whole process from the periphery, the way he watched everything, quietly and without comment. He'd seen the Navy team arrive with their laptops and diagnostic equipment and their easy confidence. He'd stepped aside as they ran cables through passageways he'd been mopping for nearly a decade. He'd heard them talk about the submarine systems using terminology that was technically correct, but somehow missed the point, the way a music professor might analyze a jazz solo without understanding the feeling behind it. He'd noticed things, small things that he kept to himself because nobody had asked, and because he'd learned a long time ago that old men offering unsolicited advice to young officers was a waste of everyone's time. But that night in January, Walter was working late because a pipe had burst in the museum's shoreside restroom, and he'd stayed to clean up the mess. He was walking back to the parking lot when he saw the lights still on aboard the Tarpon and heard voices carrying across the water. He stopped. He could hear the frustration in those voices, the clipped sentences and sharp tones of men who were running out of ideas. Something pulled at him, something that had been pulling at him for months. He stood there in the cold for a long time, his breath making clouds in the dark air, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his old coat. And then he walked down the gangway and stepped aboard. He found Commander Ellison and 3 of his engineers in the control room, surrounded by spread-out schematics and open laptops, arguing about flow rates and valve timing. Ellison looked up when Walter appeared in the hatchway. The commander's face was drawn and pale under the fluorescent lights, dark circles under his eyes, his uniform wrinkled in a way that would have earned a reprimand in any other circumstance. He stared at Walter for a moment, taking in the grey coveralls, the mop bucket Walter had forgotten he was still carrying, the weathered face of a man who, to Ellison, was simply the janitor. "Can I help you?" Ellison asked, and the question carried just enough edge to make clear that he didn't think Walter could. Walter set the mop bucket down. He looked at the schematics spread across the plotting table, the ones showing the aft ballast system in meticulous detail. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said quietly, "You're missing a valve." The room went silent. One of the engineers, a young lieutenant named Torres, actually laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the kind of laugh that escapes when something is so unexpected and so absurd that the brain doesn't know how else to respond. Ellison didn't laugh. He just looked at Walter with an expression that was equal parts confusion and irritation. "Excuse me," he said. Walter pointed at the schematic. His finger, thick and scarred and slightly crooked from an old break, landed on a section of the aft ballast piping, just forward of the engine room bulkhead. "Right here," he said. "Between the main flood valve and the aft trim manifold, there's a manual bypass valve. It's not on your drawings because it was never on any drawings. It was installed by the crew as a field modification during a deployment, 1968, Western Pacific Patrol. The original flood valve linkage failed at depth, and they had to rig an emergency bypass to get the boat back to the surface. After they got back to port, the repair yard was supposed to remove it and restore the system to original configuration. But the yard was backed up, and the boat was scheduled for another deployment in 6 weeks, and the chief of the boat at the time convinced the engineering officer to leave it in place as a backup. It worked perfectly, so they kept it. It became part of the boat's institutional knowledge, passed down from crew to crew, but it was never added to the official documentation because nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork of reporting an unauthorized modification on a fleet submarine. Ellison stared at him. Torres had stopped laughing. The other 2 engineers were frozen in place, one of them with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. The silence in the control room was absolute. Walter continued, his voice still quiet, still steady, the voice of a man who was simply stating facts. "The valve is a quarter-turn ball valve, 2-inch diameter, brass body. It's recessed into a pocket in the hull framing, behind a cable run on the port side. You'd never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. When it's closed, it restricts flow to the aft ballast tanks by about 30%. That's your problem. Someone closed it at some point, probably during the decommissioning process when they were securing all the hull openings, and because it's not on any schematic, nobody knew to check it. Ellison found his voice. "How do you know this?" he asked. And for the first time, there was something other than authority in his tone. There was something close to desperation. Walter Briggs reached into the collar of his coveralls and pulled out a thin chain. On it hung a pair of old dog tags, worn smooth by decades of contact with skin, and a small brass dolphin pin, the submarine warfare insignia of the United States Navy. He held them up, and the overhead light caught the dulled metal and made it glow. "Because I served on this boat," Walter said. 1966 to 1972, Engineman 2nd Class Walter J. Briggs. I was 22 years old when I came aboard and 28 when I left. I stood watches in that engine room for 6 years. I was there when that valve was installed. I helped machine the mounting bracket in the boat's machine shop. I was the one who tested it after it was put in. And every patrol after that, the first thing I did when I came aboard was reach behind that cable run and make sure it was in the open position. Because if that valve was closed when you tried to flood the aft tanks, you'd get exactly the problem you're having right now." The control room remained silent. Torres was staring at Walter like he was looking at a ghost. One of the other engineers had set his coffee down and was gripping the edge of the plotting table with both hands. Ellison's mouth was slightly open. He closed it. He opened it again. Then he said, "Show me." Walter nodded. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked aft, through the crew's mess, through the forward engine room, past the massive Fairbanks Morse diesels that he had once known as intimately as his own heartbeat, and into the aft engine room. The engineers followed him in single file, navigating the narrow passageway with the careful awkwardness of men who were not yet comfortable in the submarine's cramped spaces. Walter moved through the boat like water through a pipe, instinctively ducking under low overheads, stepping over knee knockers, turning sideways at the narrow points without breaking stride. His body remembered every inch of this vessel. His hands found handholds in the dark that his eyes didn't need to see. He stopped at a point on the port side of the aft engine room, reached up into a mass of electrical cables and hydraulic lines that ran along the overhead, and pushed them aside. Behind the cables, recessed into a pocket cut into the hull framing, was a brass valve. It was green with age and almost invisible against the surrounding metalwork. It had no identification tag, no label, no marking of any kind. It was a ghost, a piece of equipment that existed in the physical world but not in any official record. Walter reached up and grasped the valve handle. It was stiff. Decades of corrosion had seized it in the closed position. He pulled a small crescent wrench from his back pocket, the same one he carried every day for his maintenance work, fitted it to the handle, and applied steady pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed through the engine room like a pistol shot, the valve broke free. Walter turned it 90 degrees to the full open position. He looked at Ellison. "Try your ballast test now," he said. They ran the test the next morning. Commander Ellison had his entire team assembled in the control room, every station manned, every instrument monitored. Walter was not invited. He'd gone home after showing them the valve, driven back to his apartment, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat in his kitchen looking at an old photograph on the wall. The photograph showed a group of young men in dungarees standing on the deck of a submarine, squinting against bright Pacific sunshine, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning the reckless grins of men who had just survived another patrol. Walter was in the centre of the group, 24 years old, lean and sunburned, with a full head of dark hair and the quiet confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. He looked at that photograph for a long time, then he went to bed. At the shipyard, the test commenced at 0800. Ellison gave the order to flood main ballast tanks. The Christmas tree indicators shifted from green to red as the valves opened in sequence. Water rushed into the tanks with a sound like distant thunder. The depth gauge began to move, and this time the aft tanks flooded in perfect synchronization with the forward tanks. The submarine settled evenly into the water, her deck going awash, her sail cutting the surface like a knife. She dove, smoothly, obediently, beautifully, the way she had been designed to dive 79 years ago. She slid beneath the surface of the testing basin and hung there, neutrally buoyant, perfectly trimmed, as if she had never stopped being a submarine, as if the decades of rust and silence and neglect had been nothing more than a long nap from which she had finally been awakened. In the control room, nobody spoke. Torres was the first to break the silence. He pulled off his hard hat, ran his hand through his hair, and said very quietly, "The janitor fixed it." Ellison didn't correct him. He stood at the periscope station, his hands on the railing, and stared at the depth gauge showing a steady 12 feet. Then he picked up the phone and made a call. 2 days later, Walter arrived at work at his usual time, 6:30 in the morning, and found Commander Ellison waiting for him at the top of the gangway. Ellison was in his dress blues. Behind him, the entire engineering team was assembled on the submarine's deck in a formation that Walter recognized immediately, even though he hadn't seen one in over 50 years. They were standing at attention. Walter stopped. He looked at Ellison. He looked at the formation. He looked back at Ellison. "What's this about?" he asked. Ellison stepped forward. "Engineman Second-Class Briggs," he said, and Walter felt something shift inside his chest at the sound of his old rate and rank spoken aloud for the first time in decades. "On behalf of the United States Navy and the crew of the USS Tarpon Heritage Alive project, I want to formally apologize for not recognizing who you are and what you represent. I also want to inform you that the Navy has requested your participation in the public demonstration as a technical advisor. We'd like you to be aboard when she dives." Walter stood very still. The morning sun was coming up behind the submarine's sail, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The water of the harbour was flat and calm. He could smell diesel fuel, faint but unmistakable, drifting up from the engine room hatch. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. He tried to speak and found that his throat had closed up. He swallowed hard. He blinked several times. Then he straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and his posture changed in a way that made every man on that deck understand that they were not looking at a janitor. They were looking at a submariner, a man who had earned his dolphins the hard way, in the cold, dark waters of the deep, standing watch over a sleeping world that never knew his name. "I'd be honoured, Commander," Walter said. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. Torres broke formation first. He walked forward and extended his hand. "I owe you an apology, sir," he said. "I laughed. I shouldn't have laughed." Walter took his hand and shook it firmly. "Son, I've been laughed at by better men than you on boats a lot deeper than this. Don't give it another thought." One by one, the rest of the team came forward. They shook his hand. They asked him questions. They wanted to know about the boat, about the old diesel navy, about what it was like to serve on a Tench-class submarine during the Cold War. For the first time in 9 years, somebody was asking, and for the first time in a long time, Walter was telling. He told them about the patrols, the weeks and months beneath the surface tracking Soviet submarines through underwater canyons so deep that sunlight was a memory. He told them about the emergency dive drills at 3 a.m, the sound of the diving alarm ripping through the boat like a scream, and how you learned to go from dead sleep to battle stations in under 30 seconds, or you didn't belong on a submarine. He told them about the heat in the engine room, 130 degrees on a bad day, and how the enginemen worked their watches in nothing but shorts and boots, and a sheen of sweat and diesel oil. He told them about the friendships forged in those conditions, bonds between men who trusted each other with their lives every single day, bonds that distance and time and the world's indifference could never fully break. And he told them about the valve, how Chief Petty Officer Raymond Kessler, the chief of the boat, a man with 22 years of submarine service and hands like oak roots, had designed the bypass himself during a crisis at 400 feet when the primary flood valve linkage snapped and the boat started an uncontrolled descent that could have killed every man aboard. How Kessler had jury-rigged a temporary fix using parts from the machine shop and a section of pipe borrowed from the auxiliary seawater system, working in near darkness while the boat groaned around him and the depth gauge climbed toward numbers that nobody wanted to see. How they'd surfaced that night, and Kessler had sat on the deck in the moonlight, smoking a cigarette with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and said, "We're putting a permanent bypass in tomorrow, and if anyone from the yard tries to take it out, they'll have to go through me." Nobody from the yard ever tried, and the valve stayed, a secret shared among the men of the Tarpon, a piece of knowledge passed from one crew to the next like a sacred trust. Until the last crew left the boat and the knowledge went with them, scattered across the country like seeds in the wind, living only in the memories of aging men who had once been young and fearless in the deep. The public demonstration of the USS Tarpon took place on a clear Saturday morning in March, in the calm waters just off Fort Monroe in the Chesapeake Bay. Over 12,000 people lined the waterfront. News cameras from every major network were positioned along the shore. The Secretary of the Navy was aboard a support vessel. 3 members of Congress watched from a reviewing stand draped in red, white and blue bunting. And aboard the Tarpon, standing in the engine room in a set of Navy-issue coveralls, with his name freshly stenciled above the pocket, was Walter Briggs. He was wearing his dolphins on his chest. The boat's public address system crackled, and Commander Ellison's voice echoed through the compartments. "All stations report ready for dive." The responses came back one by one, each compartment confirming readiness. Then Ellison said something that wasn't in the standard procedure. "Engine room, this is the captain. Engineman Briggs, status of the aft ballast bypass valve." Walter reached up to the valve he had helped install 57 years ago, the valve that had saved the boat then and saved it again now. He felt the cool brass under his fingers. It was open. It had been open since the night he'd freed it from its decades of corrosion. He keyed the intercom. "Captain, engine room. Bypass valve is open and functioning. All systems nominal. The boat is ready to dive, sir." There was a pause. Then Ellison's voice came back, and if it carried a slight tremor that only Walter could detect, neither man ever mentioned it. "Very well, engine room. Dive, dive, dive." The diving alarm sounded. That sound. That ancient, urgent, beautiful sound that Walter had heard 1,000 times and had never expected to hear again. It cut through the years like a blade, and suddenly he wasn't 71 years old standing in a museum. He was 22, and the boat was alive around him, and the ocean was waiting, and everything that had ever mattered was happening right now in this steel tube surrounded by men who understood. The main vents opened. The sea poured into the ballast tanks with a roar. The deck tilted forward, gently, controllably, exactly as designed. The hull creaked and settled under the growing embrace of the water. Through the engine room hatch, Walter could see the waterline climbing the periscope as the sail slipped beneath the surface. And then the Tarpon dove. She dove the way she had always dived, with the quiet determination of a machine built for one purpose and fulfilling it with absolute precision. The noise of the surface world faded. The light dimmed. And in the engine room of a 79-year-old submarine, a 71-year-old man stood at his station and felt the deep close around him like the arms of an old friend. Tears ran down his face, and he did not wipe them away. This was where he belonged. This had always been where he belonged. On the surface, the crowd watched the Tarpon's sail disappear beneath the water, and a cheer went up that could be heard across the harbour. The Secretary of the Navy turned to an aide and asked who the man in the engine room was. When he was told, he asked for a full briefing. 2 weeks later, Walter Briggs received a letter from the Department of the Navy officially recognising his contribution to the Heritage Alive programme. The letter was signed by the Secretary himself. Enclosed was a Navy Meritorious Civilian Service Award, one of the highest honours the Navy can bestow on a civilian employee. A month after that, the Navy's Historical Command sent a team to interview Walter and formally document the existence of the bypass valve and the story behind it. The information was added to the official technical records of the Tench-class submarine, correcting an omission that had persisted for over half a century. Commander Ellison recommended that the valve be officially designated the Kessler-Briggs valve, honouring both the man who designed it and the man who remembered it. The recommendation was approved. Today, if you visit the USS Tarpon, you can take a guided tour through her compartments, and when you reach the aft engine room, your guide will stop at a particular spot on the port side and point to a small brass valve with a newly attached identification plate. The plate reads, Kessler-Briggs Manual Ballast Bypass Valve, field installed 1968, documented 2026. This valve, unknown to official records for 58 years, was preserved in the memory of the men who served aboard this vessel, and was rediscovered by former engineerman 2nd Class Walter J. Briggs during the Heritage Alive restoration. The guides always tell the story. They tell it the way Walter told it, with respect for the men who built the fix and the tradition that kept it alive. And when visitors look at that valve, tucked away in its hidden pocket behind the cables and the pipes, they begin to understand something important. They begin to understand that a submarine is not just a machine. It is the accumulated knowledge and courage and sacrifice of every man who ever served aboard it. That knowledge doesn't live in manuals or computers or engineering schematics. It lives in the hands and hearts of the men who stood the watches, And sometimes the most critical piece of knowledge in the world is carried not by an admiral or an engineer or a commander with a chest full of ribbons, but by a quiet old man with a mop, a thermos of coffee, and a pair of worn dog tags hidden under his coveralls. Walter Briggs still works at the museum. He turned down the retirement package they offered him. He said he wasn't finished yet, but he doesn't just mop anymore. 3 mornings a week he leads a special tour of the engine room for visiting Navy personnel, teaching young submariners about the old diesel boats, about the men who sailed them, and about the things that no manual can ever fully capture. He wears his dolphins every day now, and every morning before the museum opens he walks back to the aft engine room, reaches up behind the cable run and checks the valve. It is always open. It will always be open. Because Walter Briggs is still standing his watch. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that the people who keep the world running are often the ones nobody notices. Share this story with someone who deserves more recognition than they'll ever ask for. And the next time you walk past someone in a janitor's uniform, remember Walter Briggs and the secret valve that only he knew. Because heroes don't disappear. They just go quiet for a while, and the deep never forgets its own.